In this video, we are going to learn how to make HTTP requests from a Flutter app. We are going to use a fake REST API and we shall make the different HTTP request. So you are going to learn how to perform the different operations on a REST API. Create, read, update and delete. Along with this, you are also going to learn how to work with asynchronous functions in Flutter. So the first thing that we have to do to make an HTTP request from a Flutter app is to install the package HTTP. So run the command flutter pub add HTTP on the terminal inside the root directory of your Flutter project. So here you can see that this is the default Flutter app which gets created whenever you create a new Flutter project. So this is a new Flutter project, and here on the terminal inside the root directory of my Flutter project, I am executing this command flutter pub add HTTP, or you can go to pub.dev and search for the package HTTP and follow the installation instructions. Now after installing this package, we can start using the APIs. We have to import the corresponding library inside the file where we want to write the relevant code. We are going to create a helper class, a class where inside this class we are going to write different functions for perform the different HTTP request. So here inside the lib directory of the project, let us create a new file, new Dart file named HTTP helper. Inside this file, we are going to create a new class named HTTP helper, and here let us create a few functions for the different HTTP requests. Inside this class, inside this file, we are going to write the code related to HTTP requests. So we are going to use the APIs of the package HTTP. So here we have to import the package, the library http.dart. Now this library http.dart has some top level functions like post, get, etc. corresponding to the different HTTP requests, and for convenience of calling them, for clarity, we can import this library using a prefix. So here along with the import statement, if we add as and then a word, a string, this will be used as prefix. Now we will be able to use this prefix to call the functions. For example, if we need to call the post function to make a post request, we shall call http.post. So this makes it clear that we are calling the function of the HTTP library. Now let us create the different functions inside this class. So let's create the first function for fetching all the items. Then we shall create one function for fetching the details of one particular item. Then we shall create one function to add a new item to the database, then another to update one item, and finally to delete one item. Alright, so let's create the functions. Now the first function that we are going to create will be to fetch a list of items from the backend, from the API. So in case of a to-do list app, this may be a list of tasks for a particular user. In case of a blog or news app, this can be a list of articles or list of posts. So inside this function, we are going to make an HTTP request to the corresponding API, and that API is supposed to provide us some kind of a collection of some kind of data, some kind of item, and then we are going to parse it and we are going to create a list of maps. So basically we are going to convert the individual items to instances of map, of the class map, and then we are going to return that list of map from this function. Here instead of map, you can use any custom object. So in this case, to keep it simple, I'm going to use a map. So the return type will be future of type list of map. Now list of map, because we are going to get a list of map from this function. But why this future? So if you are wondering that, then let me quickly give you an idea, and I'll also add a link to a detailed tutorial in the description. You can watch that after watching this video. So in Dart, the class future represents the result of an asynchronous function. So first of all, you have to understand the difference between a synchronous function and an asynchronous function. A synchronous function blocks the execution, whereas an asynchronous function does not block the execution. Now imagine this function to be a synchronous function. This is not, and this is going to be an asynchronous function, but for a moment just imagine that this is a synchronous function and we have implemented it. We have written the code to make an HTTP call, get the data, parse the data, and finally return the list of map. And somewhere inside our code, we are making a call to this function to get the data. And below that call, we are writing the code to display a loader to the user to indicate that we are getting the data. Makes sense, right? Now, as this is a synchronous function, the user is not going to see the loader during the process, because this function here is going to block the execution until its completion. So it will make the HTTP request, it will wait for the data, it will get the data, it will parse the data, it will return the data, and then only the code below it will be executed. So the user will not be able to see the loader, even the user will not be able to interact with the app. The app will basically freeze because no other code will be executing during that time. So this is not the expected behavior, right? And thus, whenever a function needs to perform a long running task, we have to make it asynchronous. So if a function needs to make HTTP calls, if it needs to interact with the local database or the file system or any other long running task, then we have to make that function asynchronous. Now, if this were an asynchronous function, this would not have blocked the execution. So it will start executing this function parallelly, but it will not block the execution here. So the code below it also will start executing. So the user will see the loader and it will be able to interact with the app. And in the future, whenever the data is ready inside this function, it will notify us about that the data is available or an error has occurred. So we can take a look at that and we can get the data, or we can handle the error. And now in Dart, whenever you need to create an asynchronous function, before starting the body, you have to add the keyword async, and that function has to return a future. And the actual data which the function is going to return will be the type of that future. So in this case, our function is going to return a list of maps. So this future is going to be of type list of map. Now whenever we call this function will give us an instance of future immediately without any data. So the instance of future is kind of a promise that some data will be available in future if no error occurs, and if any error occurs, the error will be available inside this instance of future itself. So we have to keep looking at that future for the data. Now the function will start executing and without interrupting the normal flow of execution, and whenever the data arrives, whenever it parses the data and the data is ready, then it will put that instance of list of map inside this future, and if any error occurs, then it will put the error inside this instance. So we have to work with the future, we have to keep looking at it for the data or for the error. And there are different ways to work with the data of a future. We are going to explore some of them. Now here I have created a variable of type list of map, and I have initialized it with an empty list, and we are going to make an HTTP request here. We shall get the data and we shall assign the result to this variable, and finally we are going to return it from this function. Now let us create another function to fetch one particular item from the API. Let's name it getItem, and we are going to add one parameter here because we are going to pass the ID of the item to be fetched. The return type of this function is going to be future of type map, because this is a single item. We shall get the item, we shall get the data of one particular item, we shall create a map using that data that we get from the API. Alright, so here let's create a variable of type map, initialize it to an empty map. We can create maps using this curly brackets, right? And then we are going to return this from this function. And as this is an asynchronous function, we are returning a future, and we also have to use the keyword async before starting the body here. In this portion, before returning, we are going to make the HTTP request to the API. Now let us create the function add item to add one particular item. This function will get the map of data. So we shall pass a map containing the data to be added to the database. Alright, so we shall pass a map. Thus let's add a parameter of type map. Let's name it data. And from this function we are going to return a boolean. So we are going to return the status, whether the update, whether adding the item has been successful or some error occurred if it failed. So we are going to return boolean Now again, this function is asynchronous, so this will be a future of type boolean. And from this function, we are going to return either true or false depending on the result of the API call. So here let's create a variable of type boolean and initialize it to false. And below it, we are going to make the HTTP request and we shall get the result. We shall check whether the process has successfully completed or any error has occurred, and then we shall return the result. Now we are going to do something similar with the next function, which is for updating one particular item. So let's copy this code and paste it, and now let's change the name to update item, and this function will get this map with the data to be updated. Along with this map, it is also going to have another parameter, another string for the item ID, because we are going to update the information of one particular item, right? And to identify that item, we have to use the ID of the item. Again, from this function, we are going to return the status of the process. So we are going to have this boolean, and the return type will be future of type boolean. Similarly, let us create the delete function. So let's name it delete item. This too is going to return a boolean. So return type will be future of type boolean, and this will get the item ID to be deleted. All right, so let's add the parameter item ID, and inside again we are going to perform the deletion operation, and if is successful, then we are going to return true, otherwise false. So here we are going to make the actual call to the API for deleting the item by this ID. Now let us make the actual HTTP request, and for that we should have the API endpoints, right? So we should have some URL where we can make an HTTP call, HTTP request, and that URL should give us the data or perform some operation, alright? So in this case, for this example, we are going to use a fake API provided by the website called jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. Go there, and here you will find some fake APIs. So we have fake APIs for post, to do, user, album, comment, etc. We are going to use this one for the post. So if you make a request to this URL, jsonplaceholder.typicode.com/post, then it will give you a list of posts. So this is a JSON array. Inside we have some JSON objects, and inside the individual JSON objects we have the data for a particular post, some kind of a post. All right, so we are going to make a GET request to this URL, and we shall get the data, we shall parse them, and we shall display them on the UI. All right, similarly, you can go to this link guide, and you will find the instruction on making the other HTTP request, how to fetch one particular item. So you can make a request, a GET request to this URL, where you add the item ID after post, and it will give you the information, the details of one particular item by this ID. Similarly, you can make a post request to add a data. This is not going to do anything in the database because no database exists in this case. These are fake data, but it will give you a fake response whether the item has been added or not. Similarly, to update data and to delete data, you can make these requests and they will provide us some fake response. So this is good enough for testing the functionality of our app to learn how to make HTTP requests from our Flutter app. All right. So first of all, we are going to make a GET request to this URL to get all of the items. All right. So let's copy this URL, and now let's go back to the code. So this is the function where we are going to fetch all of the items, right? Here we have to make a call to the function get of this library HTTP. We are using this prefix to import it, so we can make a call to the function using this prefix http.get. To this function we have to pass a URI, so we cannot simply paste the URL in this way. We have to convert it to a URI, and for that we simply need to call the function parse of the class URI. So URI dot parse, to this function pass the URL. So this is an asynchronous function because this may take a little longer to perform its task, right? And thus it returns a future of type response. So at the end of the operation, we shall get an instance of this class response. So let's create a variable to hold this response. And we have to use the keyword await here to wait for its completion. And we are getting this error because we have to use the keyword HTTP to access it. Now you may be wondering, what is this keyword await? So let me tell you. So this is an asynchronous function, right? This get is an asynchronous function. So this is not going to block the execution. Just immediately after starting the execution of this function get, even before it completes, the next statement will start executing, which is not expected in this case inside this function, right? Because we are going to return this empty list even before we have the actual response of the GET request. So inside this asynchronous function, we want to wait for the completion of this function before executing the next statement. Makes sense, right? So we have to make it behave like synchronous. We have to block the execution here until the completion of this GET function, this GET request. And we can do that using the keyword await. So if you use the keyword await here, it will wait until the completion of this function, and then only it will proceed to execute the code below. Now this is going to block the execution inside this function only. And wherever we are calling this function fetch item, there, as we are not using the keyword await and as fetch item is asynchronous, there it is not going to block the execution and the app will behave normally. The app will not freeze. The user will be able to interact with the app normally. Alright, so inside this function, it will wait for its completion because we need the data that we get from this function before executing the code below it. Alright, and here, as we are using the keyword await, so we are waiting for the completion of this function. Thus we don't need the future, we can get the actual data, right? So here, when you use the keyword await, you don't get a future, you wait for the function's completion, so you get the final data which is being returned from this function. So here we can create an instance of response to hold the result. We don't need to create a future. Now if you take a look at the previous discussion here, and if you use the keyword await before calling this function, this two code will behave the same way. And another important point, you can use the keyword await only inside an asynchronous function. Now from this instance of the class response, we can get the different information about the response. We can get the status code, we can get the data from it, from this instance itself. So we shall check if the status code is equal to 200, which means that the request has been successful without any error. We have got some data, or the data, we may not have a list of items, that is a different thing, but the HTTP request was performed without any errors. So if the status code, response.status code is 200, then we are going to get the data from the response, and we can get that from the field called body of this class. So response.body will give us the data in form of a JSON string, and we have to convert it to the type that we want. In this case, we are going to convert it to a list of maps, and for that we are going to use a library called convert, an inbuilt library of Dart named convert. This library has a function named JSON decode. We are going to pass this JSON string to this function JSON decode, and this will give us a list of maps. Now here let us implement all of these functions at once, and then we shall make calls to these functions from our widgets. Alright, so let us implement the next function, which is to get one particular item. So again, we are going to make a GET request to a similar URL. If you take a look at the guide of the fake API, then you will notice that we have to make a request to an URL like this one. We just have to add the ID here. Alright, so let's copy this and paste it here, and we are going to add the ID of the item to be fetched. We have the ID from this argument, right? So here we are going to add it using string interpolation. So we are making a call to this URL, this base URL, then slash post slash the ID of the item to be fetched. Then we are going to check whether the request was successful. We shall check if the status code is 200. If it is 200, then we are going to get the data from the field body of the response. Again, this is going to give us a JSON string. We are going to convert it using JSON decode, and this time JSON decode will give us a map. So this is the response of this URL slash post for getting all of the items, right? Now if we add slash item ID, let's pass 1 here and enter, then take a look at the response. This is a single JSON string, right? This is not an array, and if we pass this JSON string to the function JSON decode, this will give us a map containing these key value pairs. All right, so we shall get a map, and here we have created a variable of type map to hold this response, right? It is item, not items. And then finally we are returning this item from this function. Now let us implement this function add item to add one item. So we have to make a post request to this URL. So the URL is the same, the base URL slash posts, and we have to make the post request. So for getting all of the items, we have made a GET request to this URL, itself, and to get one particular item we have made GET request, but the URL is a little different. We have added the ID to, right? And now to add one item, to make a request to add one item, we have to make a post request to this URL. All right, so let's call http.post and pass uri.parse, then the URL. So we can copy this and paste it here. And now we have to pass the data to the parameter body, and this function too is going to return us an instance of the response. So we are going to create a variable of type response to hold the result. All right, so we have to pass the data to the parameter body, and we are going to pass it as JSON. So we are going to call JSON encode, and we shall pass this data to this function. So this function JSON encode belongs to the library convert. We have used JSON decode here, right? Now we are going to convert this map to a JSON string, and so we are calling JSON encode. We also have to pass a map to the parameter headers, and we are going to add one key value pair for the content type. We are going to pass application/JSON to the field content type. And now here too we are going to check if the status code is 200, which means that the request happens successfully without any errors. Then we are going to check if we have got a non-empty response. So if you take a look at the guide, you will notice that this API, for this fake API, returns the data that we have sent back to us, indicating a successful addition of the item. All right, so this may be different in different APIs. So you may have a different API, you may send either true or false depending on the result or something else, but in this particular API it sends us back the data that we send to it. All right, so here we shall check if the data is non-empty, and if it is non-empty, then we are going to return true. So we are going to assign the value of response.body.isNotEmpty to the boolean status. So if this is not empty, this will be true. If it is empty, this will be false. We are going to return this boolean from this function. Now let us implement the update function, and for that, first of all, let us take a look at the guide for the API. So you have to do that whenever you have to interact with an API. You have to understand how the API works, and for that you have to take a look at their guide, right? So here we have to make a request to this URL. So basically /post/item ID added to the base URL, right? Because we are going to update one particular item by its ID, right? And then to the body we have to pass the data to be updated. So here is the data. So we are going to update this item by this ID, and we shall pass the data which needs to be updated, and we have to make a put request. We have to pass the same header application/JSON, and the response will be similar to the previous one. So we shall get the data that we send back again in the response, right? Let's go back to the code now. So here is our function update item. Let's copy this portion of the code from the add item function because this is going to be almost similar. We have to add the item ID. So let's add this item ID that we get from this argument using string interpolation. And we have to change this function. We have to call put. Then we have to pass the data. We are using JSON encode to convert this map to a JSON string, and we are passing these headers. All right. And the response again will be similar. So if it is 200, then we should get some data. We shall check if it is empty or not empty. If it is not empty, then we are going to return true. Now finally, let's call this delete function. Let's implement the delete function, and for that we have to make a delete request to this URL. So again, similar to the URL we used for updating and getting one particular item, because this time again we have to provide the ID of the item to be deleted, right? So we have to make a call to this request, and we have to make a delete request. So here is our function. We have to call http.delete. Let's copy this URI and paste it here. So here again we have the item ID from this argument. So here we shall check if status code is 200, and if it is 200, then we are going to consider the operation to be successful. So if it is 200, then we are going to make status true, indicating that the item has been deleted successfully, and then we are returning this status. So this will be different from API to API, right? So now we have created the different functions to make the different HTTP requests, and now let us create the different widgets for the different pages of our app, and from those widgets we are going to call these functions of our HTTP helper class to perform the different operations. So we shall create one widget for displaying the list of posts, another for displaying the details of one particular post, then one to display a form to add a post, and another to edit one particular post. And now let us make this post list widget the home page of our app. Currently the default my home page widget is being displayed. So here we are going to change it, and we are going to pass an instance of our widget to this parameter home of the material app widget inside the main.dart file. Now if you run the app, you'll notice that the post list widget is being displayed as the home page. At this moment this is blank, this is black, because we are simply returning a container from the build function of the widget. Now let us create the UI. First of all, we are going to return a scaffold from this build function, and let's also add an app bar. Also, we are also going to display some title on the app bar, and to the body of this scaffold we are going to add an instance of an inbuilt widget named FutureBuilder, which helps us in displaying data from a future. And in this case we are going to get an instance of future by calling the function fetch items of our HTTP helper class. So here let's create a field of type future of type list of map to hold the future that we get by calling fetch items. So whenever we call an asynchronous function, it immediately gives us an instance of a future. And whenever the function completes its task, it puts the data, the final data, inside that future. And if any error occurs, then it puts the information of the error inside that future. So we can use the callback functions of the future class to get notified about these events of successful completion or error, and then we can handle them accordingly. But in this case, we are not going to use the callback functions. Instead, we are going to use the widget FutureBuilder to fetch and display data from a future. So here to the body, let's add an instance of the widget FutureBuilder. Here we also have to specify the type of data that we are looking for. So let's add list of map here, and we have to pass values for two of the parameters of this constructor of FutureBuilder. So one is future, another is builder. So to the future we have to pass the future from which we are going to get the data, and to the parameter builder we have to pass an implementation of a function, and this function is actually responsible for creating the layout depending on the data that we get from the future, data or error that we get from the future. So here this function gets two arguments. First is the build context, and the second is an instance of a class called async snapshot. This instance is going to give us the actual data or the error. So there is a field called data from which we shall get the data, and we can get the error from snapshot.error if any error occurs. Now inside this function we are going to check whether any error has occurred, then we shall check whether the data has arrived. If none of them are true, then we are going to display a loader. So here first we are going to check whether snapshot.hasError is true. So this is true when some error occurs. If it is true, then we are going to return a text widget with the error message, because we are going to display an error message on the screen. So the widget that you want to add to the widget tree has to be returned from this builder function. So in case of an error, we are going to return a text widget with the error message, and to display the message at the center, we are going to wrap this widget by the widget center. Then we are going to check if snapshot.hasData is true. This is true whenever we get the data, whenever the data has arrived, right? And inside this we are going to get the data. So as I have mentioned, the data becomes available inside the field called data of the instance snapshot. So snapshot.data in this case is going to give us a list of map. So the data that we are looking for, the data that Future provides, becomes available on this field data of the instance snapshot. Now as we have the list of items to be displayed, let's use a list view to display them on the UI. So we are going to use the constructor builder, and to item count we are going to pass the number of items that we have inside the list, and to the item builder function we are going to provide the implementation of this function. From this function we are going to return a list style, and we are going to pass the title and subtitle. To the parameter title we are going to pass the title of the post from the map, from the individual map. We can get the map using this index, right? And to the subtitle we are going to pass the body of the post. So here inside this block, if we have the data, we are creating this list, right? We are using the list view to display the content in a list. And if none of these are true, then we are going to display a loader. So here add a return statement and return an instance of the widget circular progress indicator. And to display the loader, the progress indicator at the center of the screen, wrap it by the widget center. Now save the changes and let's load the app. But here we have got an error. Let's find out what has happened. It says that list dynamic is not a subtype of list of map. So this means that we are treating a list without knowing the type of item the list contains. We are treating that list as a list of map. So here inside the list, inside the future builder, we are specifying the type here, so this should not be an issue here. Let's take a look at the fetch item functions, and here I think here we have made this mistake. We have to cast the response that we get to a list of maps. We have to cast the individual items of the list to map. So here let's create a variable to hold this value that we get by passing this data to the JSON decode function, and then we are going to call data.cast, and here we are going to specify the type of the individual items as map, and then we are going to assign this result to the variable that we have created, items. So this time this should work. Let's save this, and here we have the list of posts. Now in a similar way, let us implement the item details page. So we are going to load this widget on tapping one item of the list. So here inside the on tap function of the list style widget, we are going to use the navigator to load that widget. And inside this widget, item details, we are going to use a future builder, because we are getting a future from the function get item. We have to call the function get item, right, to get the details of one particular item. So let's create a future here, a field of type future, and initialize it inside the constructor. But this time we have to pass the ID of the item to this function get item to get the details of that particular item, right? So here let's add one field, because we are going to pass that ID from the list page to this page through the constructor. So let's add a field here and initialize it through the constructor, and then we shall pass it to this function. Now we are going to pass the ID while loading this widget. from the list page. Now inside the post detail widget, inside the FutureBuilder, inside the item, inside the builder function of the FutureBuilder, first we are going to check if any error has occurred. If any error has occurred, then we are going to display the error message. If the data has arrived, then we are going to get the data and we are going to create the UI to display the data. And in this case, snapshot.data will give us an instance of map because our future is of type map. The function getItem returns a future of type map. So we are going to use a column to display two text widgets, one the title and the second body. So we are going to display these two information only. And then we are going to return a circular progress indicator to display the loader, right? Now save the changes. And here we can see the details of the one particular post. Now let us implement the update item page. So first we are going to add two icon buttons on this app bar of the details page. On clicking one of the item button with the edit icon, we are going to load the update item edit item page to display a form to update one particular item, and on clicking the delete icon, we are going to delete this particular post, this particular item. Now inside the edit item widget, we are going to display a form, and on loading this widget, we are going to pass the existing content inside a map from the details page to this page. So we shall use them to pre-fill the text form fields of our form. So we shall create two text editing controllers. We shall initialize the value text of this in text editing controllers with the existing value, existing information, and then we are going to pass them to the corresponding text editing controllers. All right, text form fields to the corresponding text form fields. And inside the on press function of the elevated button, we are going to write the code to call the update item function of our HTTP helper class, because we have created that function to update the information of one particular item. We have to pass the item ID too. And here inside this function, we are already getting the data from the text form fields with help of the text editing controllers, and we are creating a map. We have to pass the data to be updated to the function in form of a map. So here let's create an instance of the class HTTP helper and call the function update item. To the first parameter, pass this map data to update, and to the second parameter we have to pass the item ID. So here inside this widget we have the map called post, which is holding the map which is being passed from the details page, and that map contains the ID of the post against a field called ID. So we are going to get that value and pass it to this function, and we are also converting it to a string by calling toString. Now this function update item returns a future of type boolean. So whenever we call it, it will give us a future, and once it completes its task, if no error occurs, then it will put a boolean on the future indicating the status of the operation. And below this statement, we are going to write the code to check the status, whether the update has been happened successfully or not, and depending on the status we are going to display some kind of a message on a snack bar. All right, so we have to wait for the completion of this function before we can display the message, right? Because we are going to check the status whether this was successful or not, and then only we are going to display the message to the user. So for that we have to wait here until its completion, then we'll get the status, the result, the status, and then only we are going to check the status and display the message. So instead of getting the future and then using the callback functions, we are simply going to use the keyword await here. We have already learned about this, right? If we put the keyword await in front of an asynchronous function, then it is going to behave in a synchronous way. So it will wait for its completion before proceeding to execute the next code. But there was an important point that I have mentioned. You can use await only inside an asynchronous function. So here we have to mark this function, this onPress function, asynchronous, by adding the keyword async before starting the body of the function. So now this is an asynchronous function, and inside this asynchronous function, exactly at this statement, we are waiting for its completion. And then we are proceeding to the next statement where we are checking the result of the previous statement, and then depending on the result, we are displaying the message to the user. Now save the changes, load the app, and let's try to update this information. So let's make some changes and press this button. And here on a snack bar, we can see the message post added, post updated. Now let us also implement the delete functionality, and for that, inside this onPress function of this icon button, we are going to call the function delete item of the HTTP helper class. We have to pass the item ID, and here we have the item ID inside this class itself. So let's pass it, and this will return a feature of type boolean. Thus we are going to create a boolean to hold the result. We shall use await to wait for its completion, and if deleted is true, then we are going to display a success message, otherwise a message of failure. Save the changes and try clicking on this button, and here we have got the message. Now finally, let us add a floating action button inside the list page, and here inside the onPress function, we are going to write the code to load the add post widget. And I have created the UI for the add post widget. We are going to display a simple form, and inside the onPress function of the elevated button, we are going to write the code to add the new item to the database. So now the form looks like this one. We are going to add, so here inside the onPress function, we already have the map to get the data from this input fields, and then we are going to call the function add item of the HTTP helper class. We have to pass the map of the data to be posted, and it returns a boolean, a feature of type boolean. Thus we are using this keyword await here, and we are holding the result in this boolean status. If status is true, then we are going to display a success message post added on a snack bar, and if it is false, then we are going to display the message of a failure. Now save the changes. Now let's try adding a post using this form. So let's add some data here and press this submit button, and here we have got a message of failure. But why did it fail? Let's take a look at the class HTTP helper. So this is the function add item, and here once we get the response, we are checking if the status code is 200. If it is 200, then we are returning true. Then we are checking whether it is empty or not, and we are updating the value of status, right? But this, let's try 201 here. So a standard REST API returns the status code 201 in case of creating data. All right. So let's save the changes, and this should fix the issue. And here we have got the success message. So with this, we have learned how to make the HTTP request to a REST API from a Flutter app. If this video has helped you, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let's get connected on the comment section.